Does South Carolina safety Nick Emmanwori have the high ceiling that makes him a worthwhile bet for the Falcons in round one?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Monarch Money. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money by using code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com for 50% off your first year. So if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. the iron that sharpens the iron, a.k.a. Mr. a.k.a. I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP. Still going strong on this illustrious podcast, and I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me as an everydayer. That means you make this podcast your first listen each and every day. And all you got to do to become an everydayer is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today's episode, we will talk about the latest on the Kirk Cousins saga. How does Jameis Winston signing with the Giants impact possible trade scenarios? We'll talk about the weekend moves that the Falcons made on Friday, signing Jamal Agnew as well as Feleipe Franks and what impact that does for the Falcons special teams and the rest of the roster. But of course, today is a mock draft Monday where we talk about a prospect that is projected for the Falcons with their first round selection. And today's player that we'll be talking about is Nick Emmanwori, the South Carolina safety. Over the past week, I looked at 20 mock drafts. Only one of those mock drafts had the Falcons selecting Nick Emmanwori. That was the mock draft from The Athletic, where they had various beat writers, including friend of the show, Josh Kindle, who covers the Falcons for The Athletic, had them selecting Emmanwori in the middle of round 15. If you're curious, the most popular selection among those 20 mock drafts that I looked at was 5 of them had Shamar Stewart, 4 had Jahai Campbell, 4 had Jalen Walker. And then there were 7 other guys that each had 1. And basically, there were 4 new guys that I could have talked about on today's episode: Jahdae Barron, Nick Emmanwori, Michael Williams, and oddly enough, an offensive lineman in Armand Mimbu, the tackle from Missouri. So we try to talk about different prospects, and today was Emmanwori's turn just because the Falcons are having him on a top 30 visit. But shout out to Josh. His write-up, I think, is something that's interesting, sort of point where we can jump into the conversation about Emmanwori for why he justified the pick. He said for The Athletic, the Falcons re-signed cornerback Mike Hughes in free agency, which at least stabilizes the starting positions there with a combination of Hughes and A.J. Terrell. That same can't be said at safety, where returning starter Jesse Bates, DeMarco Hellams, and Benny Sapp III were the only players on the roster, and Hellams and Sapp didn't play in 2024 before the team reportedly agreed to terms with veteran Jordan Fuller. Bringing Fuller aboard doesn't change the idea of looking for a long-term partner next to Jesse Bates. Taking Emmanwori over Georgia's Malaki Starks, who has been considered the top safety in this class for a while, will be controversial, especially for Atlanta because of its Bulldog neighbors. But his NFL scouting combine testing results, a 4.3 at 40-yard dash, 43-inch vertical jump, and frame at 6'3", 220 pounds, give him, Emmanwori that is, the kind of ceiling that might make it worth the risk. So I don't agree with a lot of that with what Josh said, as we have talked about a number of times on various topics here on the podcast this offseason. There are certain things that Josh thinks that I don't agree with. There are certain things that Josh thinks that I do agree with. And to Josh's credit, more of those have been right so far, at least so far this set. But I do agree with the part that I don't think the Falcons are done with the safety position given the Jordan Fuller signing. I think more than likely, though, that the Falcons will wait on adding another sort of developmental partner next to Jesse Bates, probably on day 3. I don't think it's going to be a priority on early in the draft, but we'll see. But as Josh mentioned, Emmanwori was one of the biggest winners of the combine alongside Texas A&M pass rusher Shamar Stewart with some of the testing that he did. And I think one of the big selling points with Emmanwori is the height, weight, speed that are proven by his combine testing that Josh laid out. I thought the other thing that stood out to me watching the film of Emmanwori is, despite sort of being this big safety that you would assume is more of a run defender than a coverage guy, I actually think his coverage is probably better than his run defense. I think he's, relatively speaking to the type of safety that you assume he is, given his size, that he has pretty solid instincts in coverage. Like, he's not elite. He's not a guy that you're going to park out there when it comes to being that sort of single high center fielder or whatnot. He's more of a split field, play one deep half, cover two type of deep safety. But I think he, for the most part, does a good job in coverage relative to what you would assume. He's not like elite or anything, but just like, relative to a guy his size. And now I think when you look at the height, weight, speed, you look at the coverage abilities, the big selling point, if the Falcons are to take Emmanwori, is the potential that he has as a tight end eraser. That with several of the top tight ends in the league on the Falcons schedule this year, George Kittle, Trey McBride, TJ Hawkinson, the unicorn, Jonnu Smith, Zach Ertz, Hunter Henry, Dalton Kincaid, etc. A lot of people think the Colts are going to take a tight end in the first round this year. Those guys are on the schedule. If the Falcons do somehow manage to make the playoffs this year, you still got to deal with guys like Sam Laporta and potentially Dallas Goedert if he doesn't get traded by the Eagles in the playoffs and whatnot. So there is value to having sort of someone that you can trust to lock down some of these tight ends. Now, I think that value is increased if you tend to play a very man-heavy defense, which I don't think the Falcons are going to employ. I think they're going to play more man covers than they played last year, but not enough to me to really justify like, oh, we got to have a dedicated tight end eraser. And that gets to my issues with Emmanwori, where I feel like once you look past the height, weight, speed, there really isn't a whole lot to sell him on. Like, I don't think the film in the 3 games I've watched of him so far tell me that he's anything more than like a third round talent. That, like, to me, just watching the film, like, I don't think his film is any better than, say, Richie Grant's film was coming out. And you guys may recall that when we drafted Richie Grant in round 2 back in 2021, I said that if I was just grading Richie Grant purely off of the film, he's probably like more of a mid to late third round pick for me. And I just think Emmanwori's film, they're different body types, but I don't think his film is like any better than Richie Grant's film was. And I feel like that height, weight, speed, which normally you would put a premium on, I think is less impactful at the safety position than any other position. That, maybe outside of kicker, punter, and long snapper, but like of the offensive and defensive positions, like I would probably say height, weight, speed matters the least at safety compared to every other position. The other 2 positions that you would say are near the bottom of that list is probably quarterback and running back. And I would put them above safety just because like Cam Newton and Josh Allen and Derrick Henry exist. So it's like, yeah, when you do find a guy that has like incredible height, weight, speed at those positions, that can be, a plus player at the NFL level. And I don't know if there's a player, I can't think of a player like that at safety, at least in recent years. Probably the closest one is like Kyle Hamilton. And what's funny about Kyle Hamilton is his stock fell. He was like the number 4 consensus player in that 2022 draft. And he fell to the 14th overall selection because he had the height, he had the weight, but he didn't have the speed that NFL teams were looking for. Yet he's been able to overcome that. And I think that's just proof of what I'm talking about, where it's like, it's not really about the speed and the height and weight. Again, don't get me wrong, Kyle Hamilton's height and weight do make him an effective player. But like even a player that didn't have quite the speed that you were looking for, he was able to easily overcome that and still be one of the best safeties in the NFL. And I feel like Hamilton's film is way better than Emmanwori. And I remember we didn't spend that much time talking about Kyle Hamilton in the lead up to that 2022 draft, mostly because, as I discussed on the pod back then, it was like the positional value didn't make a ton of sense in taking a safety when you have no pass rush, right? And like that was true in 2022, and like that feels like we can underline that same point like a million times in 2025, right? But at least with Hamilton, you could justify it a little bit more because his film was so good. The point I'm trying to make is like, I don't think you can really do that with Emmanwori. So, when I look at height, weight, speed safeties, particularly guys that have been high round picks over the last, decade or so, players that like Obi Melifonwu was a second round pick back in 2017 for, I think, the Raiders, Isaiah Simmons, who was a top 10 pick, back in 2020 for the Cardinals, are guys that I think were height, weight, speed safeties. And those 2 players did not live up to the hype. It's funny when you think about the positional value conversation, because a point that Jarvis and I have made it on pretty much every show that we have done together since January, whether it's Locked On Falcons, whether it's Locked On Sports Atlanta, the Atlanta Football Party, it's like we always talk about how the Falcons are definitely going to take an edge rusher in round 1. And it's like they have to take an edge rusher in round 1. It's like we sit here and we entertain all these other possibilities like a Nick Emmanwori because it's like we're just killing time. But like, as Jarvis said on the most recent appearance he had on the podcast, on our most recent episode, like this Falcon team is basically an unserious football team. if they don't take an edge rusher in round one this year, right? Or let's say pass rusher, if you happen to think, there's a D tackle in this class that could be a high level pass rusher in the NFL, but just may not play on the edge, right? And it's like, to me, with a lot of these other opportunities, like players that we talked about that aren't sort of pass rushers, Jahad Campbell, Malaki Starks, Will Johnson, among others, like at least I think in all of those guys' cases, you can make an argument that they could, in theory, even if they're not filling the need that the Falcons have to select in round one, they have enough upside and potential at their respective positions that could at least make you somewhat sort of second guess that decision, right? Of passing on an edge rusher. Basically, the point I'm trying to make is I don't know if Emmanwori has that, right? And like I feel like I would be higher on Emmanwori if he was as physical a player as I think a lot of people assume he is based off of his size. Right, you would assume a guy 6'3", 220 plus, is this hard-nosed box safety. And like I've seen comps to him of Cam Chancellor and Derwin James because of that size. I've seen even a Divine Diablo comp, right? The latest Falcons linebacker. And like all of those guys in college to me were like strikers. They were guys that knew how to use their size and physicality to be forces against the run. It's the idea of force equals mass times acceleration. And like to me with Nick Emmanwori, he has a lot of mass. He has a lot of acceleration, but he doesn't generate a ton of force. And it's just like, what are we doing here? And I feel like that playing personality needs to be developed at this stage in your career if that's going to happen. Basically, you either have that wasp mentality or not, right? And when I say wasp, I don't mean like a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant or anything like that. I mean the actual insect wasp, right? And there was a Caleb City, go search for it on YouTube or wherever on your social media, did a skit many years ago about different insects sort of doing a meeting. And obviously, when you explain the joke, it makes the joke less funny. But in that skit, like the wasp shows up at the meeting and is like, I just want to hurt people. And there are guys out there that play safety, linebacker, etc. Thomas Davis, Keanu Neal, Cam Chancellor, Derwin James, that have that wasp mentality. Whereas like, I just want to hurt people. Like I'm here to hurt people. And, again, that's something that endears me as a prospect. And like Emmanwori doesn't have that mentality. And so like, I'm just like, what are we doing here? Like he's a bumblebee, right? He's not harmless, right? But like mostly harmless, right? Like it's a big animal, a big insect, I should say, not a big animal, a relatively large insect that like, if you don't know anything about bumblebees, you're like, oh no, I don't want to get stung by a bumblebee, but it's not going to sting you, right? I've been stung by a bumblebee, but I was stung by a dead bumblebee when I was 5 years old, when I picked it up thinking like, oh, let me look at this bug. And I picked up a bumblebee and stung myself. Like you got to be an absolute idiot to get stung by a bumblebee. And that to me is kind of what Nick Emmanwori is. It's like, he's not going to sting you. Like, again, it's not harmless, but like, it's just like, it's a just cute little bumblebee just out here, be looking dangerous, but is not that dangerous. You know what I'm saying? So as Josh said, like he has a high ceiling. I don't really agree with that, but we'll see on that front. But we will move on and do the thing that we've done the last couple of Mock Draft Mondays, which is give you the latest update on Kirk Cousins. So that is what we're going to talk about. And sort of, does Jameis Winston heading to the Giants impact, the Kirk Cousins trade talk as we move forward on today's Locked On Falcons? So we know in the NFL world, the salary cap is a lie, but in the real world, you can't just manipulate money like you're the New Orleans Saints, because in the real world, sometimes you check your bank account and you wonder, like, where did all my money go? And between dining out and online shopping, entertainment, it's easy to lose track. And that's where Monarch Money comes in. It's your personal CFO, giving you full visibility and control over your finances. Monarch Money isn't just a budgeting app. It's a complete financial command center. You can track all your accounts, investments, and spending it in one place. So you stop just managing your money and start building wealth. Take control of your finances with Monarch Money by using code LOCKEDONNFL at monarchmoney.com, and you'll get 50% off your first year. That's monarchmoney.com, code LOCKEDONNFL for half off your first year. And we know that March Madness is here, and FanDuel is going to give you a chance to get in on the action like never before, because right now new customers can get $200 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. That's $200 to use on everything from buzzer beaters to Cinderella stories, and even who's going to cut down the nets. And you guys know, you've already experienced this. Your brackets have gone bust, right? In your normal pools, but you don't have to worry about that with FanDuel, right? That Final Four pick that you had, that Elite Eight pick that you had that got bounced, you don't have to throw your whole bracket away with FanDuel. You have so many opportunities to win money because there's so many games and you get paid instantly. So you don't have to wait around and worry about, oh no, what if this team loses in the next round or whatever? That's going to cost me. You don't have to worry about that with FanDuel. So make sure you visit FanDuel.com and don't miss your chance at $200 in bonus bets and get in on the college hoops action all tournament long. So if you missed the news over the weekend, Jameis Winston, backup quarterback, signed with the New York Giants. And how does this affect, the Kirk Cousins saga? Not to a huge degree, right? Because we look at the 4 teams that right now do not know who their week 1 starter is going to be. The Giants were one of those teams, the other 3 being the Tennessee Titans, the Cleveland Browns, and the Pittsburgh Steelers. And if the Falcons are going to work out a trade for Kirk Cousins between now and the start of the season, it's likely going to be with one of these 4 teams. Again, there's possibilities for something else to happen, but very low probability when it comes to that stuff. And if we're ranking those 4 teams from most likely to trade for Kirk to least likely to trade for Kirk, Cleveland's number 1 as the most likely team. Pittsburgh's number 2, Tennessee's number 3, and I think the Giants are number 4. So I think the Giants were already at the bottom of the list pre-Winston. They're going to continue to be at the bottom of the list post-Winston. Cleveland and Pittsburgh are the 2 teams to focus on. Tennessee, because they're in prime position to take the top quarterback in this year's draft, Cam Ward at the University of Miami, number 1 overall, are very unlikely to be in the Kirk Cousins sweepstakes unless they trade out of that pick in all likelihood. So, we've talked before about my skepticism over Pittsburgh's potential interest in Kirk Cousins, seemingly because their plan A seems to be Aaron Rodgers at this point in time. We'll see if that changes. And I assume their plan B, if they don't land Aaron Rodgers, is going to be Russell Wilson over Kirk Cousins, but we'll see on that front. I think it's unlikely that any Kirk Cousins trade is going to happen before the draft. But if any of these 4 teams are going to pull the trigger before the draft, it's probably Pittsburgh is the likeliest of those teams, just because they aren't in prime position to get one of the top quarterbacks picking at 21 overall in round 1, while those other 3 teams, Cleveland, Tennessee, and the Giants, are all picking in the top 3. I think if you're the Browns and the Giants, you're not going to be proactively seeking Kirk Cousins until after the draft, because you kind of want to see what Tennessee does with the number 1 pick, right? Do they take Cam Ward or do they trade out? I think selecting Cam Ward for any of those 3 teams would be preferable than trading for Kirk Cousins. And if you're Cleveland or the Giants, even though you probably don't think you're going to get Cam Ward, you just want to just be sure, just like, let's wait. Kirk Cousins ain't going anywhere. Right. No one's, jumping to the front of the line to get Kirk Cousins at this point in time. So there's no reason to have urgency when it comes to Kirk Cousins. Like, oh no, if we don't get Kirk Cousins, oh no, he's going to be gone. That you don't have to worry about that. So, this is the thing I've said and we'll continue to say. We've talked about the sort of musical chairs aspect of who's going to be left out with the quarterback. And that's going to be the team most likely to become calling after the draft for Kirk Cousins. And that's where the Falcons get their leverage. And Terry Fontenot gets his W when it comes to trading Kirk Cousins. But I think as we sit here today, and again, we'll see what happens, but you could definitely see a path where the musical chairs run out, right? The music stops and the Falcons are without a chair, right? Because, if Tennessee takes Ward number 1 overall, and if you look at websites like NFL Mock Draft Database, 92% of the mocks that they have the Titans taking Ward number 1 overall. And then the Giants, sort of take Shedeur Sanders, who's presumptive QB2. About 61% of their mock drafts have the Giants taking Sanders at number 3. And if Pittsburgh signs Aaron Rodgers, as some people think they might, and if Cleveland signs Russell Wilson, a player that they've shown some interest in as their sort of preferred bridges, like at that point, who's trading for Kirk Cousins? And now you're basically counting on that less than 1% chance of a quarterback training camp injury to open up an opportunity for Kirk Cousins. And that number, that less than 1% comes from, if you look at the last 10 years of quarterback trades, there's only been 1. There's been 32 teams, 10 opportunities, 320 opportunities for a team to do so. It's only happened 1 time with Teddy Bridgewater back in 2016. And the Vikings wound up trading for Sam Bradford. And so 1 out of 320 is less than 1%, right? It's 0.3% chance. And so, I know the narrative is that, Aaron was going on a tirade because he was, being wrong about the Falcons cutting Kirk Cousins. But, my rage was mostly about the Falcons offseason. We'll talk more about that later. But it wasn't about the ego. It wasn't about being right or wrong. But if we do get to that point And again, I'm not saying it's likely that it's going to happen. Right? We're at an if. Like previously, I was at a win. It was a win. A trade won't happen. Now I'm like, if a trade doesn't happen, right? If you thought my ego was, over the moon before, like we're my ego is going to be well past over the moon. We're going to be flying past Saturn on our way to Neptune, baby. You're like, you guys will never be able to say anything to me ever again. So, there is a big part of me that is preying on the Falcons' downfall just out of spite. A handful of people that, came for me after my meltdown last week about keeping Kirk. I'm just doing it out of spite now, at this point in time. Like my new AKA will be Ashton Kutcher, right? Just grimy. And if you're wondering like why, like just Google Ashton Kutcher and bathing, right? But I'm just going to be walking around just grimy, stinking, unwashed, right? Talking because my stuff doesn't stink, right? Just sitting there, just like there, you can never say anything to me ever again if I wind up being right about the whole Kirk Cousins situation. The Falcons do not have that, and it's like people are like, Aaron, you need to keep that same energy if you're going to be wrong. And I'm like, no, I'm not going to keep that same energy because that's how life is, right? So there is a part of me that is hoping that I am wrong. I know you don't believe that when I say that now. But there is a part of me just so we can have something positive to say about the Falcons this offseason because, it's like, can you get one win, Terry, with this like situation? Like, because my God, you've been taking, nothing but L's this offseason, right? This is not the win I wanted the Falcons to take, but it's like, you got to get something, right? This might be a controversial take on today's episode. You be the judge on all the controversial takes I'm going to have on today's episode. What is the most controversial one? But like this is someone asked me in the Discord, Locked On Falcons Discord, link in the description below if you want to join the conversation. But is this the worst offseason the Falcons have ever had? And I was like, in my 20 years of covering this team, I can't think of a worse situation, right? Where there have been offseasons where the Falcons did nothing. Like I think of 2018, they didn't do anything, but they were coming off of 2016 and 2017. And so they earned the benefit of the doubt. And now, like 7 years later, it's like you're not going to get that same benefit of the doubt, right? Given the pressure to win, given the need to improve so many areas, like they're arguably a worse team at multiple positions than they were at the end of last season. And that's a bitter pill to swallow, right? You arguably taking setbacks at center, edge, D tackles, corner, safety at this point in time. Again, there's still more time in this offseason, so we'll see how it all shapes out. Linebacker, I think you can argue they're maybe better at adding Divine Diablo. But mostly, I think it's a lateral move. You're basically getting Troy Anderson, a healthier version of Troy Anderson. There's growth potential at other positions, quarterback, tight end, left guard, among others, spots on this team. But it's like they're betting heavily on their young players growing, like, the defensive front, right? Like I think Judon and Jarrett were probably better veteran options than Floyd or Fox are. But at least you can say, okay, if you've taken a step back in terms of the veterans, like the growth potential, the growth that AK and Zach Harrison and Trice and Dorless and all these guys show this year will make up for that drop back. So we'll see. So, hopefully Terry gets a win, right? He's just taking so many else. So, and now you're sitting there going like, what happens if they perform out on the field better than what our expectations are based off the all season? It's like, well, that's a win for Raheem Morris, not necessarily a Terry Fontenot win. So the offseason it doesn't. We'll see what the Kirk saga holds. We'll see what the Trey Hendrickson saga holds. We'll see what the draft entails or whatever. I'm not particularly optimistic about those latter two things, coming out as wins. But hey, I'm not optimistic about Kirk. But it's like, hey, if we're betting on any win that you're going to get at this point, Terry, like that's probably your best option. So we'll see. We'll see. So again, despite wanting to be right in the end, just so I can be, so spiteful here on the podcast, and just out here, talking like my stuff doesn't stink. Hopefully the Falcons will get a win. I would like to at least at some point in the next 4 months talk about a win on this podcast because, good God. All right, so that being said, let's wrap up today's episode talking about the addition of Jamal Agnew, the Falcons' new kick returner. And is he going to be an upgrade over Avery Williams? What does this do to kill the Casey Washington hive? And of course, we got to talk about Feleipe Franks. And we'll get into all of that, guys, as we wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So the Falcons signed Jamal Agnew to basically upgrade the kick returner spot. And Jamal Agnew is someone who's very familiar with Falcons special teams coordinator Marquise Williams. They shared time in Detroit together. And during those 4 years that Agnew played for the Lions, and from 2017 to 2020, he was arguably the best punt returner in the NFL during those years. He was like fourth in yards per return during that span, first in touchdowns scored off of punt returns. He was also like top 5 in kickoff returns. He was like 6th in yards per return in kickoffs and 4th in touchdowns. Now, when you look at sort of who was the top kick returners during that span of years, Cordero Patterson was one. Jakeem Grant was probably number 2 during that span, who the Falcons tried to bring in last year to bolster their special teams, and he just kept getting hurt. But, Agnew's probably somewhere in that 3 to 5 range. Now, since he's left Detroit back in 2021 with the Jaguars, his production dipped considerably as a kickoff returner. Now, he's still probably an upgrade over Williams and McLeod in terms of being like a top 15 kickoff returner. But the punt return production also was a dip, right? And, you look at Jakeem Grant, whose punt return production since 2021, he was, I think, 7th in yards per return during that period of time. Avery Williams was 12th. Brandon Powell, another former Falcon that played for the Falcons in 2020, has been with the Rams and is currently a free agent, was 38th. And Jamal Agnew is like 39th in punt return average since then. So, even in a down year where Williams had averaged over 9 yards per punt return last year, Agnew in his most recent season, which was 2023 with the Jaguars, he's briefly spent some time on the Steelers practice squad in 2024, but has mostly been out of football over the last year and a half. Prior, Agnew averaged 10.3 yards per punt return in 2023 with the Jaguars, but the 2 previous years, it was about 7.8 yards per punt return. So even though we sit here and we talk about how Avery Williams was not an impactful punt returner, he was more impactful, at least in terms of average yards per return in 2024 than what Jamal Agnew has been combined over the last 3 years that he's been a punt returner. So time will tell on Jamal Agnew being the significant upgrade in the return game. Again, if he looks like the Detroit Lions version of Jamal Agnew, he'll be one of the best return specialists in the NFL. If he looks like the Jaguars version of it, it's probably mostly a lateral move. It's like you got better on the kickoff return game, but you got worse on the punt return game. So the other sort of fallout of this move is if you were hoarding Casey Washington stock for the Falcons backup wide receiver, it's time to sell your stock. We talked about this a little bit with the Mike Ford signing. But this Agnew signing also is just like the double tap to the body, right? To the head and body when it comes to the Casey Washington's, potential in Atlanta. Because right now he's 6 on the depth chart. There's really no path for him to climb higher on that depth chart between now and the start of the season, unless there are multiple injuries. He'll probably make the 53-man roster because the Falcons are likely to keep, 6 wide receivers on the 53. But they're almost certainly only going to keep like 5 receivers on their active 48-man roster. So he's probably going to be a player that's on the team, but is inactive most weeks, which was the case for him, as well as most of the Falcons rookie class this past season. So nothing is probably going to change with Casey Washington in terms of growth potential, like it is for several other Falcons earlier round draft picks, like, Michael Penix, obviously, and et cetera. But, there's really, I'm sure there will be people that will tell you, they could activate 6 wide receivers. And it's like, no, that person doesn't know what they're talking about, right? Like this is something I've kept track of since 2015. Now, in the Dan Quinn era, the Falcons did regularly activate 6 wide receivers, right? The main reason why is because they did not play Julio Jones a ton of snaps, and they wanted to give him a breather. He only played about 75% of the snaps. And so having an extra body at the wide receiver position so that you could rotate, 4 or 5 wide receivers, in addition to like the 2 that you had on special teams that were contributing solely on special teams, that made sense. But Zach Robinson doesn't really do that, right? Drake London played over 90% of the snaps last year. Darnell Mooney, in the 16 games that he played over 90% of the snaps. They don't really sub that guy out. And so the 5 active wide receivers are going to be Darnell Mooney, Drake London, Ray McLeod, Kadero Hodge, and now Jamal Agnew. Agnew obviously is going to be the return specialist. Hodge is coming off a Pro Bowl year as a special teams player, got a big raise this offseason. And so unless you're convinced that, Ray McLeod's going to lose his number 3 wide receiver job, which there's no real reason other than you just want to believe that, And if you do believe that, it's more likely that Hodge is going to take the job rather than Washington. But, Ray is currently the second kick returner on the team right now. You need two of those guys, given the new rules and whatnot. So, Washington really has no path for, upside. And as we've discussed many times over the years, it's hard to develop from the bench if you're not playing. I was never that high on Casey Washington as a wide receiver. As I said several times last year, the Falcons drafted him for his special teams potential, not his wide receiver potential. But as we talked about, there was a path where it's like, oh, well, they could draft him to be a special teams and he might turn into a good wide receiver, similar to what happened to Russell Gage, right? But, year two was critical for Russell Gage because, he played special teams as a rookie. In year two, we saw him make a big leap as a wide receiver because the team traded Mohamed Sanu and he became Russell Gage, became the new number 3 wide receiver. I don't, maybe you think a Ray McLeod trade is in the future, but I don't think that's likely to happen. So unless Casey Washington just absolutely dominates this summer in the preseason and in training camp, working with Kirk Cousins as the number 2 quarterback, right? I don't think that potential is in the cards. Last little tidbit before we duck out of here: Feleipe Franks also bringing him back for special teams. We were vocal supporters of Feleipe Franks on this podcast. He spent 3 years in Atlanta, primarily on the practice squad. They started him out as a quarterback. They eventually tried to convert him to a tight end. He played this past year in Carolina, was very productive, led that team in special teams tackles this past year. And so, part of me feels a little vindicated for the Feleipe Franks support that we suggested on this podcast. So special teams does matter. I do think the Falcons are likely to take a tight end on day 3 of the draft. And so I don't think Feleipe Franks is guaranteed to be here, but the level of investments, the willingness of the Falcons to upgrade their special teams this offseason and kind of, as I said, ignore the defense. Again, ignore is not the right word, but just kind of, let's say, just be complacent about the defense is really astounding. Is all I can say. So shout out to you, Terry, for doing your thing. Hopefully, it'll turn out some way, somehow in your favor. I wouldn't hold my breath, but we'll see what moves are coming down the pipe. We'll have some more guests to talk about their thoughts on the Falcons offseason moves, and if they agree with my assessment that the Falcons have been extremely complacent or whatnot. So keep in store here on Locked On Falcons. Continue to make us your first listen by checking us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And of course, check out the Locked On NFL Draft podcast to get insights into, I think Dame and Keith are much higher on Nick Emmanwori than I am. So if you want to hear the flip side of what Nick Emmanwori could bring to the table, check out Locked On NFL Draft as your second listen. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.